Okay, so I think we're going to get started today on the webinar that's being presented to you by Quan Down, who is the VP of Technology Solutions at SDC. He brings over 24 years of very deep and expertise in clinical data management and technology implementation, and he specializes in the secure, data-driven clinical innovations that we need and value in these markets today and the situation that we find ourselves in. I'm Nina Pruitt. I'm in global marketing for clinical research, software, and solutions. And today's session will begin in 2 seconds. We're just going to do a little housekeeping. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. There will be an opportunity for you to download this recording at the close of it, and then we will send you a link to that, as well as if you have questions, we're going to compile those questions and ask them pending the time in the end of the session. If we've run out of time, we will certainly then do a formal document of what those questions were and the answers and distribute to everybody who participated. So, and it doesn't mean that our conversation ends today. There's always opportunity to ask more questions in the future. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Quan to kick us off and get going.
Sounds good. Thank you, Nina. So welcome to this educational session on ensuring how you can leverage secure AI in clinical research. And the key thing here is to protect your data. My name is Quan Dung. I'm the VP of Technologies Solutions here at SDC. And as everyone knows right now, you see it all over LinkedIn, AI is the big buzz right now, right? But there's lots of terms that are thrown out there. So do you really grasp the benefits and the potential pitfalls in implementing AI? It does bring a lot of transformative potential to streamlining your processes, internally and externally, enhancing accuracy in clinical research. However, it also introduces a complex set of challenges related to data security and privacy. In this session, we'll walk through these challenges, understand the underlying risks, and discuss strategies to mitigate them. Right? We'll explore how advanced AI tools can streamline workflows, improve accuracy, as we mentioned earlier, and biggest of all, ensure compliance, right? And it's not just with the data that's being used for AI, but your AI models as well. So the key messaging here is trying to keep that sensitive data that we work so hard to gather, right, safe. So coming out of the session, hopefully you'll have a better understanding of the differences between kind of closed loop and open AI infrastructures, right? How to protect your data from start to finish or inception to closure, to CSR reporting, et cetera. And then practical steps to kind of manage that risk and maintain regulatory compliance. So let's kind of level set with AI and the terminology being used, right? I'm sure you've all heard terms out there floating out there in the market: machine learning, LLMs, NLP, agentic AI. It's all the buzz out there right now. But in general, these are all components that live under the general AI umbrella, right? And there's different applications, but things like machine learning, LLMs, and NLP all kind of constitute your bigger things like generative AI or agentic AI, right? So at the end of the day, AI is a technology that enables computers and machines to simulate human learning, comprehension, problem solving, creativity, autonomy. Another way of saying this is we're just really equipping machines, right, with the ability to perform tasks that mimic what we would do, right? Human intelligence, critical thinking, acquiring knowledge. And to sum it up in one word, what we can say is AI is really just a really cool way to predict things, right? AI systems use lots of data, right? Thinking billions of data points out there, and algorithms to analyze your data, which enables them to make statistical predictions about future outcomes, right? So if you think about it, right, we can use AI to do things like data analysis, right? It's much longer for a human to go through and parse through large data sets, right? Imagine sitting in front of a large Excel sheet, scrolling through hundreds of thousands of records, trying to detect patterns, right? AI can do that much faster, right? And uncover even potential patterns that we didn't think about as humans and giving us additional insights, right? Things like predictive modeling, right? Where we can forecast trends, outcomes based on historical data. So in the context of kind of clinical trials, as it were, right? You can look at previously designed clinical trials, their inclusion-exclusion criteria, and see how you can leverage kind of that data on enrollment previously to enhance your decision-making and to better design your protocols, right? You can also use AI to do automation, right? Streamline routine tasks, mundane things that you would do on a daily basis. That's very repetitive, right? That, as people, humans doing this work, we can introduce errors, right? And we can be less efficient, get distracted, right? Whereas, if it's a simple, routine that can be repeated over and over again, then that's where you can leverage machine learning and AI to do those tasks on your behalf, right? So we all know what the benefits look like in terms of trying to leverage AI, and especially introducing it into the clinical trial space. But there is a lot of risk to consider and to manage around that. Okay, and that's what we'll dive into today. So the new frontier of clinical data risk, right? So we already have lots of clinical data generated across our clinical trials, right? Whether we're using EDC systems or real-world source data, right? Wearable technologies have been increasingly popular, right, as of late, and then also obviously leveraging EHRs, right? Other data that's captured within our clinical trial setting space. And because we have so much data and so many different types of sources, right, we do have a lot of exposure to security risks there, right? So, and one of the major drivers in why we have all these technologies, right, is the adoption of decentralized clinical trials, right? Thinking about how we get to other geographies, right, expand diversity, equity, and inclusion into our clinical trial enrollment, right, to get better, more well-rounded results for our clinical trials. So again, these innovations undeniably improve, right, clinical trial reach, efficiency, data collection quality as well, but they also create a complex and oftentimes a more porous network of data pathways, right? Think of it as your home, as an example, right? The more doors and windows that you have, there's definitely more entry points, right, to access the home, not just for yourself, but for unintended personnel as well, right? So kind of in that line of thinking, traditional security models, firewalls, access role controls, encrypted storage, a lot of those were designed for a centralized system, right? You host your server on site, you try to protect it as much as you can, but they do struggle with kind of the software as a service model, right? And the various kind of data sources and entry points. And so they do struggle to keep up with kind of the risks of today, right? Which oftentimes do not come from hackers, right? But really from poorly integrated systems, right? You do have kind of gaps in your data models, how they're being imported and exported. And that's where we want to focus our attention, right? Unauthorized AI tools, right? You think about the software that's out there now, you may be using a current platform, and all of a sudden they have this new AI bot or widget that's being introduced. And you're like, oh, okay, Microsoft has this new Copilot thing. Can I use it? But that doesn't really lend itself, to the visibility of how that AI is leveraging your data, what they're doing with it, and parsing that data out. So again, as we expand our reliance on cloud platforms, right, APIs, third-party tools, we expand that, attack surface or area, right? So anytime we introduce a new data source, whether it's, e-consent, right, an API for that, or a trial bot, right, that helps file through and rifle through your TMF, that becomes another vulnerability that, you may or may not have thought of in terms of, data governance, okay? So really, if you look at kind of the line of questioning as it comes through to data security, it's no longer, do you have a firewall? It's really taking a step back and do we know where our data is flowing through, where it exists in our ecosystem, and can we prove that it's secure, auditable, compliant at every point, right? So just really taking that down to a much more granular level than we have in the past. This new ecosystem or environment calls for a different mindset, and it's not enough to rely on our old security models. We need real visibility into where our data is, how it's being used, and whether those tools are up to the standards that we expect in, our regulated space. So a couple of things, right? Kind of going back, many people think that, securing artificial intelligence or AI is the same as encrypting data, right? Or just kind of anonymizing your data or masking your identifiers. Now, those things are important, but that's only one small part of the picture, right? So really the question is, what makes AI secure in a clinical context, and what are the common misconceptions that we need to leave behind? So again, we just mentioned in the last slide, we do need to look beyond traditional IT controls. And it's not whether or not just the data itself is protected, right? Because we're big on that in the clinical research space, but whether the AI models behind the tools that we're using are governed, auditable, and behaves in a way that we can trace and explain, right? And that makes it a lot harder because, you do have the self-learning AIs and things out there, but it's really understanding how those models are being trained and maintained. That's the key thing. So we'll dive into a couple of points here. The first point here is that, data encryption or encrypted AI is not the same thing as secure AI, right? So we all know that, you can encrypt the data set. If you looked at security models in the past, there's encryption at rest and, encryption in transfer, right? But again, that's just one piece of the puzzle. And so think of it as if you're trying to feed that data into or leverage an AI model, right? That's not validated, that's not secure in a non-compliant environment, then kind of your entire system is at risk, right? And masking PHI, right, is not the same thing as controlling what happens downstream. You have impacts from GDPR, you have other things in there, right? But again, masking or anonymizing isn't a surefire way to protect your data. And we talked about, again, right, it's the AI model logic, the interface that we're using and how those outputs are being used. So if any one of those layers is weak, right, the entire system is at risk, right? The whole adage of, you're only as strong as your weakest link. You also hear the term that's thrown out there for privacy preserving AI, right? Sounds good. But if you ask yourself, from that AI model perspective, does it log your inputs and outputs? Can you maintain a kind of version of the model? Think about, because we're talking about self-learning models and things like that. So how do you manage the version control around that? And can you audit it, right? And then the last piece here with the AI security that we do hear thrown around a lot is kind of using the human in the loop, right? So it's often used as a safety net, which is a great thing, but it's not a one-size-fits-all, or it's not a magic solution, right? So again, if you have your underlying model that is flawed or opaque, right, and you have a human that maybe isn't as well versed kind of in that space, they may miss items, they may not catch the bias or see that there's a potential manipulation in the results until the data errors continue or it's too late, right? So again, if we want to use AI responsibly in the clinical research space, right, we do have to expand our definition of security and not just include the infrastructure, the data, but the behavior and the governance of the models themselves that is being used to support all the tasks that you're doing. Okay. So a couple of things that come into mind, right? Obviously, we are a regulated space. There's a lot of guidance documents and things that are available out there, but they have been a little bit slower to adopt, right? So you think about the timing of when, ChatGPT and some of these tools were introduced, right? The AI race, as it were, started about three years ago, right? It's probably a good time frame. So there is a mismatch between the speed of adoption of AI and the maturity of the governance frameworks, right? So looking back about 3 years ago, it's exciting. Everyone's wanting to jump into it, but FDA finally released a draft guidance, January of this year, right? The EU as a whole, right? They've not in the clinical research space, but they've provided guidelines on kind of AI usage with personal data, and that was, I think, tail end of last year, so end of 2024. So whether it's large pharma or small research sites, again, the risks are real, and we do see adoption going faster than how fast governance frameworks are coming out. So a couple of examples I wanted to run by the team here, right, is how AI is outpacing those frameworks. So example number one is, this is a pharma company that used ChatGPT to summarize reports, right? They hired outside consulting. they worked with the sponsor, and they used ChatGPT to summarize internal reports, right? Without realizing that, if you feed this into a ChatGPT model or something that's out there, that tool retains that data, right? It's going to try to use that data to leverage broader learning and may use it for training their models, right? And in this particular instance, that exposed proprietary trial data that should have been kept inside our validated systems, right? And this is an example of what we call AI drift, just to put another term out there, right? I think we all believe that everyone here has good intentions in terms of how they want to use tools to supplement their jobs, right? But the absence of the boundaries and approved tools kind of creates that risk in, putting your IP out there and compliance risk, right? So again, looking internally for your organization as well, understanding if there are policies that are available around acceptable use of AI. And if there's not, that leaves the door open to these types of potential data leaks, right? Another kind of case example here is a lot of people do this, right? You have Siri, you have Alexa. Hospital researchers can use voice transcription tools, right? A lot of them nowadays are AI enhanced, right? To help process the dialects, the accents, the language, and everything, convert that into physician notes for digital records, right? But what we don't know is behind those tools or those services, are they aware of kind of the HIPAA compliance requirements, right, to be used in the clinical research space? Was there a BAA or business associate agreement in place, right, to expose that HIPAA, for use in the clinical trial space? So again, in this particular case, when you're doing those types of transcriptions, patient data can be transmitted and stored by that third-party system, right, depending on the solution that's being used. And that wasn't authorized to handle PHI, right? So again, a lot of things that we've mentioned kind of at the top of the call too, right, is that a lot of times you're using your existing tools, you've had them for years, and all of a sudden there's this new AI widget that's made available, right? It's often embedded, right into the service that you're using because you've used them in the past and you felt that they were secure. But again, it's not just about the data itself, but the underlying AI infrastructure and modeling that's used behind the scenes as well. So if those systems don't have the right encryption or access controls, they can also become a liability as well, right? And again, right, talking about kind of looking at our solutions that are available out there, right? The big thing is, and we talked about it at the top of the hour, was using a closed loop AI system. So one of the big things that we want to look at here, right, is that the closed loop systems are designed with security kind of at the forefront, at the mindset, right? There's a big difference between what we see in open models out there, the ChatGPTs of the world, and a closed loop AI system, right? So can run through this relatively quickly. In an open model, right, the AI is always learning, right? So it can be sending data out to external servers. You're pulling data from third-party solutions, right? We talked about the billions and billions of data sets that are available out there, right, that are used to form those LLMs, large language learning models, right? And that creates obviously risk, right? Because again, you can have proprietary data leaks, right? You're dealing with patient data, trial endpoints, sensitive information, and you don't have that control. It ultimately feels like it's a black box that you're putting all of this into, and you can't guarantee that all of that is secure, right? In a closed loop AI system, right, on the other hand, we build that from the ground up, right? You have controls around what data it's accessing, how that's stored, how it's being transported, right? And controlling kind of the inputs and outputs that come, into your system, right? And the big thing here is compliance and reproducibility, right? It doesn't learn from your data unless you explicitly tell it to, right? There's tools and things out there that will help you govern and manage kind of all of those aspects, right? Every component of your AI system as a whole, from inputs to outputs, into a controlled auditable framework, right? So a couple of things, there's 4 areas that you want to think about with any AI solution, whether it's homegrown or you're outsourcing it and looking at a third-party vendor, right? So data governance is key, right? First thing is it starts with your data. Without that, you really don't have much else, right? So every input is validated and access to that data is tightly controlled, right? Only authorized users can interact with the system, and only authorized users can actually feed and train the AI models, right? You don't want kind of your end users training all of the models at the end. You wanted that to be a controlled process. So there's no mysteries, there's no kind of ancillary data that you're not aware of making its way into your system, right? For model governance, right there, again, we talked about this earlier, right? You can do fine-tuning and training of data models, and they can still learn on the fly, but you don't actually push that out there for end user consumption, right? So this is where we use isolated engines, right? So we're feeding it some context within the AI environment, and we're iteratively saying, okay, we're going to train this model up until this data point, right, with this idea or this context or this persona, right? But we're not actually going to push it out for end user usage, right, until we've verified and made sure that everything looks legitimate, right? So kind of a way to think about that is think about ChatGPT 3.0 that was out there before, right? That was released. It wasn't very good. And again, they put controls around it to do ChatGPT 4.0, right? Which is has a much stronger framework, right, for processing kind of natural language, how we speak, and it was a much better product in that. So same thing comes to when you're dealing with model governance, right? We can still train on data, but we want to do controlled releases of that model to make sure that it's still within our framework, it's still compliant, and there's no data leakage, right? Audit trails, obviously, in the regulated space, every interaction should be logged, right? So as you are asking your questions of your AI solutions and getting outputs back, we want to be able to capture those interactions, right? We can capture them to leverage and understand, give you that full visibility and traceability to kind of how the AI is working, making it less of a black box for you, and also allows us to fine-tune the model, right? Because over time, if you ask several questions, many different ways, we can make sure that those are all applied in the learning model, right, and give you the output that's consistent, right, and reproducible. And then finally, with closed loop systems, right, again, our systems are developed in a sandbox environment, no external access, right? Usually those are behind the firewalls that we talked about, some of those legacy infrastructure terms, right? But that keeps us controlled in an environment where we know that we're not leaking data out there and that we're, training to everything that's inside our validated infrastructure. So again, just to summarize, when we talk about closed loop AI, that's talking about a lockdown, controlled system that we can trace, we can explain kind of how that system works and kind of all the bells and whistles behind it. And that aligns with what we know as regulatory expectations, right? It's not just about security, it's also about accountability. And that's what allows us to deliver AI insights in a way that's safe for patients, trustworthy for sponsors, CROs, and other sites. So coming back to kind of regulations and what their framework looks like, right? Both the EMA and the FDA are always increasing their focus on explainability and traceability, right? The concern isn't just about security, but also ensuring that AI doesn't introduce hidden biases, right? That's not inconsistent in decision making. We just talked about that, or patient safety issues. Keep in mind, clinical trial space, is a little bit slower to adopt new things, right? It took years to adopt, EDC, right? It's still taking years to adopt eSource, right? And keeping in mind that regulators aren't opposed to change and they're not anti-AI, right? They do support its use to improve trial efficiency and data quality, but they do expect accountability, right? They want sponsors and vendors to show how decisions are made, how they're being monitored, and how to prevent errors or biases, right? So whether you're using that software for, clinical actual operations work, right, or to make clinical decisions, to support other tools, right, the burden of transparency and control sits with you as a sponsor. Again, we talked about kind of AI, the framework, regulatory complexes, and when it comes to clinical research, right? Again, it's treating AI as a plugin, right? Again, talking about utilizing existing software, sometimes those are things that you can bolt on or you can turn on with the existing tools. And that's, as we mentioned earlier, that's exactly what a lot of your vendors are currently doing, right? You see it in Microsoft with Copilot. And those tools may or may not sit within their core infrastructure, right? Because it's the hot thing right now, it may look innovative, right? But it still introduces that risk, especially when you're dealing with sensitive data and patient data, right? So just to kind of summarize here, right? We did take a different approach at SDC in terms of utilizing AI tools, right? So we're building out a closed loop AI system that's fully embedded within our technology stack, right? We do have those controls for data governance, access controls, AI validation, and monitoring. So those are all requirements that we, thought of up front and kind of worked in, right? So again, looking at our kind of bolt-on versus built-up models, right? In a bolt-on environment, you don't know how that data is being used or where it's going, right? But for us, right, we know that we've built everything. We know what that workflow looks like, and we know that that data never leaves the environment, right? So we know that we're aligning with those global standards out there, right? Whether it's HIPAA or GDPR or even sponsor-specific requirements. Every data point that's fed into our system is governed and traceable, right? Again, we talked about access controls and things like that. So again, being able to not just access, your clinical study data within that environment, right? But also understanding, is that data accessible for training the model or not as well? So we do have the ability for, sponsors, partners to either opt in or opt out. They can definitely leverage AI tools, right? But do they want their data being utilized to train the models moving forward or not, right? So being in a closed loop allows you to have those types of controls. And then the big thing here we talked about earlier is that versioning, right? That AI validation, right? Validation in the traditional context is, a one-time event, right? Or, repeated over every 3, 4, 5 years. But we're always continuing to do continuous validation on our models, right? In a separate environment. We want to make sure that our outputs are reliable and audit ready. And because we're version controlled, right, we can always call out to inspectors and show regulators, right, this is the logic engine that we used for this clinical trial versus maybe one down the road. Okay. So just a couple of examples really quick, right? This is an example of a bolt-on model, right, where we were using ChatGPT as a third-party tool. Here in this particular instance, we dragged in a synthesized data set or a couple of data sets into the tool here to see what outputs we could get, right? And thinking about kind of, again, that kind of external model or that black box model here, right? The larger LLMs out there aren't specifically trained for the clinical trial space, right? So the results that you see here in terms of asking the question, right? They give you two different disparate tables, not what we're used to typically seeing in the clinical trial space. And so one, the output isn't what we're expecting. And two, now that I've put those data sets into this tool, we don't know where that data set is going to be stored or if it's going to be used for future learning analysis, right? But switching kind of to more of SDC's model, you can see we asked the same question, right? We knew what the data set was. It was tied to a data warehouse where we have those data governance controls. And you can see the summary table is much more aligned with what we would see in like a summary table for our TLF outputs, right? And it's also introducing actual kind of data trends that make sense within the clinical context. And so again, from a security standpoint, we're secure, but then also in that kind of ground built-in model, right? You do have more controls around fine-tuning that AI model, understanding how it's being trained, and that's going to be key, right, for deploying a model that works in this space for what you want to do, right? So a couple of things just right before we sum up here, right? Again, I think AI is here to stay, right? Whether you choose to build something from the ground up or use a third-party vendor, right? We want to give you some guidance in terms of how to vet your AI partners for that data protection, for that security and integrity, right? So again, not all vendors are the same, right? So it is essential for us as a team to create a checklist that is effective in comparing providers that will meet your needs and your regulatory requirements. So a couple of things to get you started, right? So one is data quality, privacy, and security. So again, you need to work with a vendor that understands how they're going to manage that data, right? Are you as the kind of vendee, right, providing that data source and you have controls around that, or does that data need to get imported into their system? And then if it does, how is that managed? How is that cleaned? And how are they securing, your data and not mixing it in with other clients' data, right? Do they follow the frameworks that are out there for our space with regards to HIPAA or GDPR privacy laws, right? There's certifications out there, and do these companies hold those certifications? If you have to ask twice, or if they're giving you the runaround around data lineage and security, that's definitely a red flag, right? The next big thing to look at when you're looking at vendors is the engine under the hood, just like when you're buying a car, right? How do they maintain their models, right? Can they perform consistently across clinical trials or therapeutic areas? Do they have experience in the clinical trial space, right? Can they scale up or down? Because AI can be expensive, right? So you think about if you're only using this on 1 or 2 trials worth of data, right? Can you scale down, keep your costs down, but keeping performance? Or are you looking at a program of work, right? That has, 30 studies, and if you ask your tool a question, it takes 30 seconds to respond, right? I think we're in a space where we like our answers more immediate than that. So being able to scale up and down your models, and can they integrate with your existing tools and solutions, right? So if you can't leverage AI in a place where your team is working right, it's not going to add value. So we want to make sure that that makes sense. Transparency and explainability, right? So again, making sure that the results that's being produced or the predictions, you can understand how it's coming up with that, right? Does the vendor provide audit trails in terms of kind of the questions and tools that you're using, how it's being asked, how the answers are being returned? Do they build in the human in the loop process, right? Kind of as part of your transparency or explainability? And have they validated their tool on clinical trial data or real world data kind of in our space? So those are things that are going to help you a long way when it comes to data integrity. And then last but not least is really your long-term support, right? So they can build a tool for you, they can provide a tool for you, but what does it look like once you're up and running, right? Again, how can we enhance the product over time, train it to more of your company's needs? And do they have a roadmap that incorporates new AI capabilities over time? This space is changing so rapidly that 6 months from now it can look vastly different. So we want to make sure that you're, joining or selecting a partner that has you in mind, that thinks kind of long-term strategy and includes kind of your requirements in that thought process as well, right? So again, this isn't about this is about getting past that sales pitch, right? When you're just looking at a vendor. So picking a partner that's built for compliance, transparency, because your data is so important and so sensitive. We don't want to take shortcuts because that's definitely not worth the risk, right? And then again, just to sum up kind of the entire webinar, right? AI is here to stay, right? It is the hot buzzword now, but it's going to make its way into our space, in the near future. So it's being armed right now with the right information, right? We do want to make sure that all the tools that we're kind of integrating have to be balanced with robust safeguards, right? OpenAM's quick for iterative kind of proof of concept type things, experimentation. But once you're actually tying that to your clinical data, that's where you want to look at a secure integrated solution. And that's where kind of SDC, Sidekick and other tools come into play, right? Our solution definitely is a closed loop solution. We have all of the tightly controlled architecture and infrastructure. We understand where our data is coming from, and we track and trace kind of all of the learnings that our AI models are doing, right? So again, first and foremost, keeping your data, right, secure, under lock and key from the moment that we have it, right? Making sure that we are aligning with regulatory compliance, right? And as a data services company in the space, obviously we have Part 11, Annex 11, GDPR, HIPAA, kind of top of frame of mind, right? And we don't use kind of open AI tools to develop our secure AI tools. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as well. So again, just to help summarize things up, right? AI is here to stay. We talked about, risk mitigation, regulatory compliance, consistency and control. And these are the things that you definitely want to keep in mind as you're leveraging these tools. And we want to harness AI's full potential, right? We want that faster data processing, predictive analytics, streamlined workflows without sacrificing patient, data integrity. And so, in short, just to kind of summarize, we do have a closed loop system here that's designed to give you the best of both worlds. Cutting edge AI technologies and capabilities, and a compliant infrastructure that's tailor-made for this space. And so with that in mind, I know we're right at time. So if there are any questions, Nina, we can try to address them now or follow up.
Well, I thank everybody for staying on. We are a couple minutes after the bottom of the hour. If you do want to stay on, we do have a question that came to us, and it was talking about what are some of the practical applications that you're seeing or experiencing in AI across the different channels or stakeholders or activities, deliverables that have to be done within the clinical research environment? Are there some that are taking off faster than others, or
Yeah,
what do you have?
Yeah, there definitely are certain technologies that are taking off faster than others, right? So a lot of it is kind of in that generative AI space where you're looking at, either protocol development or CSR writing, right? So a lot of those, you already have templates out there that are available. And so there are definitely lots of solutions out there now that are focusing on kind of document generation, right? Using AI in the clinical trial space, but not so much in more of your day-to-day operations, right? So there are not, no AI solutions out there that are automatically generating and responding to queries on your behalf, right? There's things that are starting to get there where people are starting to fine tune those requirements and getting into that space, but you're largely going to see it in the doc generation space at this point.
And to follow on with that, there was a couple of additional comments that were talking about using it for sort of the data insights that you can get from AI to make better and smarter decisions, effective decisions. Plus, how is it that we complement with the AI output and the human portion, which are both actually topics that are coming up in the webinars 2 and 3. So if you haven't signed up for those, certainly there's an opportunity. We'll follow up with you and of course provide you this question and answer set and deliver to you the recorded webinars. It's a wild west, right? And so having these tools with which to be smart about your decision making is very important, and understanding what it all does. With that, I think we can come to a close. Quan, thank you so very much for providing this input today and sharing with us your expertise. We look forward to both the next session on those insights on June 3rd, same time, 12 noon East Coast, various other times around the globe. And then the third webinar session, which is the 24th of June. And that's going really into that. How do you implement AI, as well as how do you get your stakeholders on board and realize that it's not necessarily replacing FTTEs, but it's basically letting them do their jobs that they're really good at in a complementary way. So we look forward to having you in those. And if we are all good, we'll sign off and send you out. Have a great day, everybody.